Good morning. I'm Bill Eggers, the Executive Director at Deloitte Center for Government Insights, our public sector thought leadership arm at Deloitte. And I'm thrilled to be here today with our panelists and all of you who have joined us virtually to talk about Government Trends 2024. Government Trends is our marquee annual global report on the state of government around the world. We've been publishing this since 2020. And the 5th edition, Government Trends 2024, was published just in March of this year. Government Trends is not only our center's, but one of Deloitte's most read publications. Last year's report had over 160,000 page views, and our recent report is already #1 on Google search for the term Government Trends. The Government Trends report highlights 8 to 10 of some of the most transformational public sector trends every year. Next slide, please. As you see in the slide, each year our report is a central theme. A few years ago, it was obviously the COVID-19 pandemic. The year after, we looked at being future ready against potential alternative disruptions. And last year's theme was how governments are tearing down silos to embrace broader collaboration within and outside of the public sector. This year's theme is 10x government, and the report highlights how modern governments are 10x or exponentially better than their predecessors across everything from being faster, more agile, more efficient, and productive. Next slide, please. Governments are strategically combining multiple tools and techniques for this transformative impact. And as you can see in this slide, beginning in 2019, every iteration of the Government Trends report has covered trends that still remain relevant today. Some trends, such as digital government, have been constant throughout the years, and others, such as equity and resilience, have emerged more recently. And each year, the individual trend articles within our report highlight how a particular trend manifests itself within a particular government subsector, such as defense or public health, or how it enhances operations like back office. Now, this year's trends articles, rather than being sector or operation specific, concentrate on how governments are enhancing citizen and mission outcomes exponentially by being faster, more efficient, agile, resilient, and overall more capable. And if you go to the next slide, you can see these slides, the trends at a glance this year. Trends such as government at warp speed, unleashing productivity in government, and nurturing ecosystems to supercharge innovation, and 10x improvement in customer experience. If you go to the next slide, please. What this slide shows is that convergence is really the key element to achieving this sort of 10x change. It's the convergence of technology with process, policy, workforce, and regulatory innovations that have unleashed public sector transformation. Governments are strategically combining multiple tools and techniques for transformative impact across operations, service delivery, customer experience, and mission outcomes. Now, in this session, we're going to delve a little deeper into how a 10x more capable government can tackle some of society's most pressing and toughest challenges, whether it be climate change or supply chain reorchestration. And today, I'm honored to be joined by two colleagues of mine, Beth McGrath, the Government and Public Services Industry Leader for Deloitte Global, and Ursula Brennan, the Public Sector Leader for Deloitte Australia. And I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Beth.
Sure, thanks, Bill. Really happy to join you and Ursula today. And, as Bill mentioned, I have the honor and privilege of leading Deloitte's government business globally. Prior to joining Deloitte, I also had the honor of working for 25 years in U.S. Department of Defense. And I would say, my job jar was pretty much the business of defense, really optimizing resources and delivering outcomes and capability. Great to be here today.
Thanks, Beth.
Good morning, everyone, and great to be with you, Beth and Bill, talking about Gov Trends. I'm Ursula Brennan. I'm the National Leader for Deloitte's Public Sector Practice in Australia, and that gives me the intense privilege of being able to coordinate services from across our business to support state, federal and local government clients across the country to really deliver better outcomes for citizens. And I also lead our Business Case Centre of Excellence, which helps clients secure funding for major infrastructure, ICT and reform programs. Great to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Ursula and Beth. So the first question is for both of you. Where have you seen 10x or exponential improvement manifest themselves in government? And why don't you take the first one, Beth?
Yeah, sure. And as I mentioned, they spent decades working in the government. And Bill, in your introduction, you talked about policy process, technology, but also regulation and outcome. And so, forever we talked policy process and outcome, but rarely did we sort of knit them all together to say, if we took a more holistic look at, how we do what we do in the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, what are the levers and characteristics that sort of need to be true in order to achieve the outcomes. And so one example, no one has quite cracked the procurement or acquisition process, I'd say, in any government just yet. But what we're hearing right now and what we're seeing sort of all over the world from a national security perspective is the need not just for speed, but for for relevance in a very sort of acute way. And it was probably in the 2015 timeframe, and it was the Defense Department in the United States set up the Defense Innovation Unit. It was exponential in the beginning, or experimental, sorry, to really say, hey, could this work if we took a different approach to acquisition? And, what would, again, need to be true in order for us to stay within the boundaries of federal acquisition regulations and policies, but also really accelerate capability in the hands of, in this case, the warfighter, but you could, insert any federal organization to say, how do you get stuff to the market faster? And so they took a super innovative approach, really brought industry in and said, hey, here's some areas where we really need your help to really describe the problem in a way that it was not written like a contract, but it was more, sort of plain English. Let's talk about what the needs are, and then let industry really put sort of their best foot forward in terms of, what are some of the capabilities or approaches they would take. And that way, you could design something and then you tested it, what a concept. And then if it worked, you could then, I'll call it a follow-on like contract in a much, much faster way. It gave transparency, it allowed competition, it stayed within the regulations. And so I think you're seeing sort of more and more governments around the globe really look at, where could we, increase the speed of relevance, if you will, because everybody knows technology moves like in nanoseconds, if not faster, and government procurement and cycles are a lot slower. So again, I think you're seeing a lot more governments lean in a much more holistic way, but you're also seeing, the existing policies and procedures challenged in I'll call it productive way to enable speed.
It's a great example, Beth. Actually, a close friend of mine was the staff director working on that piece of work for probably a good year. And as you said, just so many meetings with industry players and with other stakeholders, and really looking at commercial best practices all over the world, as well as government best practices to get to where they got to. Ursula. Oh, go ahead, Beth.
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, it really represents the partnership that's required between industry and government to get stuff done. I think at the end of the day, sometimes we forget the reason government puts out contracts is because they need help with something. And so they want the sort of industry's sort of thinking to be embedded in what they're doing. So sorry, I didn't mean to cut Ursula off there, but.
No, not at all. And I think all the things you're saying and you're talking about that you're seeing globally, Beth, we're certainly seeing some of those being reflected in Australia with increasing cases of that sort of 10x improvement in public sector capability. I think one of the things that we're certainly really focused on is it's a relatively small population, but a very large country. And how do you actually provide essential services that are going to be able to support citizens day to day in a way that is actually efficient but gives great citizen outcomes. So one of the things that we've been seeing in the Australian context relates to public hospitals. And increasingly, we're seeing much more in the way of advanced analytics to actually reduce costs, but actually improve patient care. So a number of hospitals have actually deployed predictive tools recently that actually look at anticipating patient admissions, injury types, what's the effect going to be on bed availability, and mapping all of that with staffing, which is a key challenge for us, thinking about staff absences, availability of the right capabilities. And what that's allowing them to do is to forecast resource availability over a number of different timeframes. That might be hours, it might be weeks, even years in advance, which really helps in terms of being able to ensure that those services are available in the right way, at the right place, at the right times. And while some of the direct cost savings for hospitals can be fairly modest, the increased access to health services has led to tens of millions of dollars of benefits in the form of improved patient outcomes right across the country every year. So that's a great example of all of those different aspects of technology, regulation, that convergence of people and process coming together.
And Ursula, it does seem like when you think about that example and hospitals and the resource allocation and being more predictive, you can apply that to so many areas in the public sector, from law enforcement to social services to transportation and so on, to really increase effectiveness and that resource deployment, especially in an environment where resources are tight, but also it's a very tight labor market, and many governments are struggling to find all of the talent that they need, and this can really help to make sure that talent is put in the right place at the right time to be most effective.
Absolutely. It's a great enabler, that one.
Now, the second question I wanted to look at was some of the big pressing challenges we're facing today in societies all over the world. There's a term that talks about us living in a polycrisis world where you have multiple threats like climate change, supply shocks, global conflict, cyber attacks that are endangering vital systems that sustain human society and the global economy. And withstanding and addressing these challenges will require no small amount of resilience and innovation, and really particularly a lot more agility in governments. Beth, what are you seeing in terms of governments enhancing resilience and agility?
Yeah, polycrisis almost feels like it understates the sort of the magnitude of things sort of happening around the globe, and from national security to climate security, equity, social, equity for folks. And, the government's in I'll say a unique situation in that they own the pen, and they own the pen to write policies to then drive behavior. But they're also being called upon to sort of react and support and enable, for citizens or for populations or for democracy. I mean, you could just sort of go through all of the sort of polycrisis, segments and say, and the government has a role to play in each one of them. And so I think each government wants to strike I'll call it the right balance between sort of legislation and enablement. And so there's this, how do you fortify capacity from both a national level and a global level, and what are the levers you do to enable those outcomes? Do you use your pen and write some sort of legislative or legislation, and then drive through policy and implementation, and then how do you get others to invest in terms of, sort of the carrot stick mentality to say, how do you encourage industry to also engage. And so it's this, I'll call it a happy place between sort of policy and legislation and, incentivizing sort of industry to participate. And then you layer in this, how is all this technology sort of helping, or how do we need to safeguard sort of technology? Ursula gave a couple of examples around, sort of AI for good, but then there's some who are using AI for not so good. And so it really is this sort of everyday opportunity that government has to try and sort of hit the sweet spot between sort of writing legislation, enabling things to happen, being a customer orientated a body for citizens and people, and do it in a way that's fast. And so we talked about I mentioned the speed of relevance as something that has been discussed for decades and decades in a national security perspective, but the speed of relevance is applicable to sort of everything we're talking about, be it healthcare, be it education, housing for different families. And so I think there is also, this, where does sort of government interest and private sector industry interests also intersect? And, with all the things happening around the world, there are sort of economic, industrial industry making decisions that, we're trying to align with sort of national security and national interest. And so it really requires, go back to the, it needs to be a partnership between government and industry on not just, a contract. It's, what are the sort of values and ethos and everything that we're doing? And then how do we align both interests and then outcomes? And maybe one example is we all experienced COVID and PPE. We all learned what PPE was or is, and we all wanted a mask, but we all then, all just say got a very acute appreciation for the supply chain. Sort of what is it, who's in it, and that's just for this what I'll call single thread-ish of mask and thing we need with regard to COVID. But Russia, Ukraine, all of a sudden wheat, who knew? Like most people did not understand the supply chain. And so I think this is the overlay of sort of things happening in the world and how it affects both government and people, and then how these things really need to be aligned. And so you are seeing some different countries look at legislation around, how do we make sure that we've got the capacity and capability for those things that we care about, and how do we partner with other nations who have similar sort of ethos, if you will, from a democratic perspective. And so you really are seeing this, before this 20 years of globalization, and you just got it fast and cheap wherever you could get it. And now there's this, well, not so fast. And there's much greater consideration for a much more holistic perspective on so many things, to include supply chain. Everybody, semiconductors and chips, there's all kinds of legislation being written about that. But I feel like there's also this, need to make sure we don't over rotate one way, right? Not really understanding exactly or being able to predict where the world is going. But you are seeing a lot of countries, certainly the United States and some of the European countries, European Commission, UK, others, all working on, what does it take, and what do I as a nation need to secure, and what do I as a nation need to make sure that I've got partnerships around the world to enable, things to happen in the way they wish at both a national and a global level.
Absolutely, and what you mentioned gets a lot to the idea of friendshoring, which we're seeing a huge increase in all over the world, with Australia being very involved in many of those, with the United States, the UK, Canada, and elsewhere. Ursula, how do you see 10x government being more capable of driving innovation to solve very complex problems like climate change, the green energy transition, where you need the private sector, the public sector helping to fund it. You need academia in there in driving innovations. And also there's thousands and thousands of social enterprises working on that on that area. And in the end, you need individual citizens all over the world to see some behavioral change. So how do you see 10X relating to the climate change and energy transition issues?
Well, some of those changes, some of the challenges are just so big, so complex. And when we think about climate change, cybercrime, energy transition, a number of the issues that Beth was just talking about, you actually need radical innovation and much more of a systems approach. So just as we were discussing, those challenges actually need innovation at a scale that government simply can't do alone. And particularly we see in the Australian context as well, we look at what other governments around the world are doing all the time and see, well, what can we actually learn from them? So certainly the friendshoring is a good example, but actually it goes much more broadly into that to say, well, who is actually thinking very clearly about the sorts of ecosystems that need to come together to be able to bring that diversity that you were just talking about, Bill, of government, private sector, academia, communities, because together they've got the solutions. So the role of government we're seeing increasingly is much more around how do you very much actively nurture those ecosystems, help support them, bring them together and provide the right incentives that actually encourage that participation between public sector, private sector, appropriately, of course, with all of those other parties, with small and medium enterprises, with for-profit organizations, to actually come together to find a common solution. And one of the things that we've looked at is, and it's covered in the GovTrends report as well, is actually the Danish government has done some really interesting work around climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And looking at the scale and the array of the solutions that were available from the private sector, the Danish government actually divided the economy into 14 sectors and said to each sector, come to us, develop those industry-specific climate partnerships. We're going to look at what makes sense in your specific industry, bringing together everything from construction and commerce and agriculture and finance, because they've all got really quite different challenges that you need that industry expertise to be able to solve. But the invitation from government actually carried the responsibility, which was each partnership was tasked with presenting a proposal around how their particular sector could help contribute to the national objective of, I think it was a 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Now that's an enormous opportunity, but also obligation. And the proposals from the partnerships were required to say to government, give us tangible recommendations around how we can support and actually facilitate some of those green initiatives. In total, those 14 partnerships submitted 432 recommendations. And I think it was by last year, about 80% of them have been either fully or partially implemented. And for me, that really just talks to the power of how do you actually bring together the whole of the ecosystem to solve these really complex problems that government simply can't solve just on its own.
Absolutely, Ursula. And, that's it's been near and dear to my heart for many decades, and the subject of the book we recently published with Harvard Business Press called Bridge Builders. And one of the things we found in the research was that in this area of the new energy transition, there's a lot of innovation occurring all over the world, and with government playing a very catalytic role in creating these markets, facilitating them, looking at where there's holes in the market and so on. One of the examples I came across recently was in California, where they issued $3 million in awards to investor projects that were developing biomass gasification power plants that can run on cut brush and logging slash generated by wildfire prevention programs. And there's a plant in Sacramento, California that plans to decarbonize the hydrogen produced by sequestering 450,000 tons of carbon dioxide in saline aquifers. And so we're seeing a lot of interesting financial models in there. Forest resilience bonds is another example. We're seeing green banks and so on and so forth in facilitating what will be one of the most biggest energy transitions, certainly in our lifetimes. Beth, you talked a little bit about supply chain and what a big issue that is, certainly around areas like semiconductors right now. What actions can governments take to further strengthen their supply chain resilience?
It's interesting is when I was in government, there was this, I'll say, relationship that the government had with the prime, and that's sort of as far as it went, right? And then it was sort of the prime's responsibility to manage subs. And I'm not saying the prime shouldn't manage the subs, but I'm saying the transparency was limited. And I think what we're seeing, again, go back to all the, what do you call it, polycrisis that's happening, sort of around the world. I think it's caused us, again, as I mentioned before, to really understand sort of what is the supply chain, not just from a citizen perspective relating to COVID, but also, semiconductors. You saw the weight for cars and sort of everything else that has a semiconductor in it. But you're seeing government also sort of reach in a little bit further to say, hey, as you're looking at your supply chains, and this is a broad statement, we want to make sure you know who and what's in it. And so you're seeing, like, going back to sort of the power of the pen to really then drive behavior through government to say, and we want to know that sort of what and who is in your supply chain. So from a policy perspective, you're seeing more things. And what I have seen, in particular in the national security space around the globe, is really a need to understand what is the current baseline. And again, from a national security perspective, or any organization that buys equipment, you really want to know sort of who's making what and what's in there. And so you've seen over the last probably 5-ish years more sort of technological capability around illuminating a supply chain, really understanding risk and resilience associated with supply. And it could be, bad actors. It could be, I have a single source of a key component part in a tank. It could be a mom and pop shop that has been in existence for years, and now the owners are sort of getting old, and what's going to happen to that? And so resiliency is sort of takes on this broad definition, but you are seeing more and more like policy plus capability, and it really is, I think, a lot more of a holistic perspective on understanding the supply chain and how it ties to the outcomes that government intends to achieve. And a little bit ago we talked, or you mentioned, like friendshoring and reshoring and things like that. This all plays into that sort of same conversation about who's in your supply chain, where does stuff come from, and your last question with Ursula around sort of carbon and energy. Everybody's looking for alternative energy sources, and to really understand, so where does that come from? So it's not just the sort of a platform, a tank, a ship, a plane, but it's energy sources as well. And really understanding, how do you get those? Are they aligned with your geopolitics and things like that? And so it really is this polycrisis, multidimensional, sort of holistic discussion, where before, many years ago, it seemed very sort of one at a time. And now you can't take one topic at a time. You must really zoom out and understand the whole picture to then zoom in, or hone in and achieve your objectives.
And Beth, one of the things that I've seen a lot is just the technology and tools, the data tools that we have then to look through the supply chains and calibrate that better have just come such a long way just in the last few years.
Oh my gosh, it's we started with the what one component part, if you will, in a very long supply chain, and then it's connected to people, connected to nations, connected to. So you have this really very holistic map of insight. I'll put it that way.
Where you can also look at the risks in each of the elements of the supply chain. Ursula, I've spent a lot of time in Australia over the last 2 decades, as you
Not
know.
enough. Keep coming back.
And one of the things that every time I go there, there's such a focus on innovation and government, private sector, academia working together around innovation at scale. A lot of national reports looking at innovation in the country and so on. So that's my question to you is, what are some steps that governments can take to further enhance their ability to catalyze innovation at scale via these very diverse ecosystems around all sorts of areas that are important to our future?
Yes, it's a great challenge, Bill. And you talk about innovation at scale, which is always the thing that's probably hardest to be able to achieve for governments. We touched earlier on the ecosystems, and we've talked about some of the partnerships that you need. I think there are probably 3 things that are really key for government to look at. The first is about actually acknowledging what the ecosystem is, and sometimes that's being able to work out what is the ecosystem. How does it come together? What are the components of it? And similar to what Beth was just talking about in the resilience, how do you look through to understand whether it's from contract data or supply chain information to actually be able to map who are the players in the innovation ecosystem that need to come together, and use that to actually help understand and uncover what are the relationships that bring that ecosystem together and help bind it to be successful. The second thing is ecosystems are like natural ecosystems. Innovation ecosystems can be really messy. And being able to just embrace that messiness, reflect the fact that you're going to have competing interests. And if incentives across those different stakeholders are misaligned, that can actually really cause the component players in the ecosystem to work against each other. So really getting into what are the incentives that will make a difference can be quite messy and human. And I think being able to look at that messiness, use some qualitative data, interviews, surveys to help understand what's actually driving each player can be a significant step towards achieving a better innovation outcome. And the third area is about thinking through how government leaders can embrace the concept of government as a gardener. So what are the right conditions that government can help set that then allow that ecosystem and the innovation outcome to grow naturally? So I think by using what we've learned about innovation ecosystems, leaders can begin to anticipate when will an intervention actually deliver the right cascade of responses from other players? What's going to impede that? How do you provide the right protections and supports around that, or the right regulatory incentives or the right investment incentives in a way that actually moves that ecosystem closer to its common goal? But if you can't understand what the incentives are and how to get people aligned by really understanding deeply the ecosystem, it becomes much, much more challenging.
And
Yeah,
Bill,
absolutely.
Bill, if I could pile on, like everyone wants innovation in their organization, and so they stand up offices for innovation, but the alignment and the objective, right? They need innovative ideas to achieve the objective. Is I think at the end of the day, what everybody is aiming for. If it's reducing unemployment, increasing housing availability, equitable access to internet and schools and healthcare and things like that. And so I think the challenge is really sort of, we need your innovative ideas, and this is the thing we want to go do. And really, allow the innovation to happen in a I'll call it a sandbox of I'll call it a regulatory sandbox that says, if I'm constrained by sort of policies, laws, and regulations, what would you do? And then, of course, we'll have to, layer in sort of all the policies. But I feel like so many times, and again, this is my decades of government speaking, people throw up the existing law, policy, or regulation and say, oh, we can't do it because of this. And so I really feel like this, let's drive to the objective we want to, achieve, and then let the innovation happen. Just my 2 cents piling on to Ursula there.
No, absolutely, and it's so important. The mapping, the ecosystem is a really crucial, important first step. Actually, we just developed the ecosystem mapping tool that will enable you to look at a variety of these things, from semiconductors to climate, and look at the ecosystem involved there. And then what are the incentives for the different players, because the incentives are going to be very different, and then you have to find ways of creating mutual advantage and understanding the collective impacts by pinpointing what are the leverage points in the network for the green energy transition, such as energy distributors, and using them then to create network structures to drive the green energy transition. And then those kind of leverage points can then stimulate positive feedback loops across industries, and almost creating a flywheel effect, as Jim Collins writes about. And the governments also have a whole series of indirect tools that they're increasingly using around these sort of markets, whether it's emission caps and carbon pricing, or innovative financial models, or increasingly tax credits and tax incentives and competitive grants. And so it's the effective use of those tools and understanding the incentives of all the players that are really key. And when you look at most of society's big problems today, they're ecosystem challenges, and the ecosystems are the way that we're going to actually solve these. And for that, we need a lot more bridge building going on between the different sectors. Well, I want to thank you both for such an interesting conversation today on Government Trends 2024. I also want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in and wrapping up our chat on the Government Trends 2024. I just wanted to say, in this era of boundless possibilities, governments really are standing on the precipice of transformative change. Armed with innovative tools and strategies and a collaborative mindset, the journey to 10x government shouldn't just be an aspiration, but a reality waiting to be seized. And in fact, when we were doing our research on this, we found over 200 cases all over the world, governments actually creating and achieving this kind of 10x level of change. So please remember to check out the full Government Trends report on Deloitte.com, and look out for our Government's Futures Frontiers podcast, where we discuss the biggest issues facing governments across the world. And you can find that one on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And that brings our session to a close. Thank you so much for joining.